The morning sun cast long shadows across the twisted metal and scorched concrete of Pearl Harbor, as Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rushford hunched at his desk, surrounded by towers of intercepted Japanese missiles. It was late April 1942, and the capitalist had seen Senley Weeks. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, but his mind was sharper than ever. Something beat his current. He could feel it in the patterns of enemy communications, in the increased radio traffic that flowed through Station Hypo like a river threatening to burst its banks. Outside its windowless office in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, the Pacific Fleet was a shatter of its fullness self. Full battleships lay on the harbor bottom. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed. More than 2,000 Americans had died with that infestation annoying. The Japanese had struck with precision and overwhelming force, leaving America's Pacific defenses in ruins. But Rushford knew something the Japanese didn't. The Americans weren't eaten. They were learning, adapting, and preparing to strike back. "Sir, another intercept from the Japanese Fourth Fleet," said one of his cryptanalysts, placing a freshly decoded message on Rushford's classic desk. The young officer's face showed the strain of endless hours spent wrestling with the enemy's naval code. They're requesting additional supplies for something called Operation MI. Rushford's tired eyes suddenly blazed with intensity. For weeks, his team had been tracking fragments of a massive Japanese operation. The youngie was playing something that would dwarf even Pearl Harbor. The where, when. The coded designation AF appeared repeatedly in the intercepts, taunting them with its mystery. If they could crack this puzzle, they might turn the tide of the entire war. Admiral Nimitz stood at the window of the headquarters, gazing out at the salvaged crews still working to raise the sunken battleships. The white-haired Texan, in command of the Pacific Fleet, its stoutest hound, inheriting a demoralized force and an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Behind him is Intelligence Officer Commander Adrian Layton cleared her throat noisily. "Admiral, Rushford's team believe they've identified patterning Japanese indications," Layton reported. "Something major has been planned for early June. The fail suggests it's their largest operation since the all began." Nimitz turned from the window, his ice-blue eyes focused intently on Layton. The Admiral had learned to trust his intelligence officers, even when their conclusions seemed impossible. "I may the commanders dismiss code-breaking's unreliable guesswork. Nimitz has today information's the most powerful weapon in line warfare." "House-spoken only," Nimitz asked, his voice kind waiteth on. Every decision he made could mean life or death for thousands of sailors and Marines. "Rushford staked his career on it, sir," Layton replied without hesitation. "He believes the target is somewhere in the Central Pacific, his team working round the clock to pinpoint the exact location." He Admiral Nod Fly. If Rushford was right, it could be the opportunity they desperately needed. The Japanese have been advancing across the Pacific high tidal wave, capturing island after island, building empire that stretched from the home islands to the shores of Australia. With every empire had its limits, and that the enemy was far of the overeating. Down near the Kurtunasis Centre, Rushford's team wit with feverish intensity. The basement room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. Banks of IBM tabulating machines clattered endlessly, sorting through thousands of code groups. Men and women in rumpled uniforms pored over group sheets, searching for patterns and the seemingly random characters. "I thought something," announced Lieutenant Commander Wesley Ham Wright, one of Rushford's top captains. "The Japanese keep referencing motor desalination equipment for A-end. Why would they need special water supplies for a major naval base?" Rushford felt the pieces clicking into place. A location that would need additional war supply, somewhere strategic and important enough to warrant a messy operation. His mind raced through the possibilities. Suddenly he knew it had to be Midway Atoll, the flying American outpost of guarded they bridges to Hawaii. One of his subordinates, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, proposed an ingenious plan. What if we have Midway report water supply problems? Is the Japanese mention it in their coded tropic? We'll know AF as Midway. Get me secure line to Leighton, Ruchwad ordered. Tell Midway to send it a medicine cement in plain landard so their water distillation plant is broken down. Meanwhile, aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Housie lay in sick bay, his body ravaged by a severe case of dermatitis. The aggressive commander who led the early carrier raids against Japanese-held islands was now too ill to stand. His task force was about to sail into the most important battle of the war, and he would be brilliant. "Bill, you look like hell," said Admiral Raymond's Boers, visiting his old friend. The two men were opposites in many ways. Housie was dogged and instinctive, while Spruance was calculating, ethical. They shared a deep respect for each other and unshakable determination to defeat Japan. "Ray, I'm game, I come on," Housie said weakly. "Keep my boys and hit those bastards hard. In trust you, and so do I." Spruance nodded solemnly. He had never led carriers in combat before, but he understood the principles of naval warfare better than almost anyone. More importantly, he knew how to listen to his subordinates and make decisions based on facts rather than emotion. These qualities would soon be tested than ways one could imagine. On Midway itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shen inspected his ragtag collection of aircraft. The Tang Atoll's air group was a mixed bag of obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, already proven inferior to the Japanese Zero, alongside a handful of newer Wildcat fighters and various bars. His pilots was the green, fresh from training with a combat experience. "Colonel, are we really expected to stop the Japanese Navy with these?" asked Miraloff Hindusser, gesturing at the line of Japanese. The Marine Navy knew the reputation of these lanes, nicknamed Zion Coffins by their parties. "We'll stop them or die trying," Shannon replied grimly. "Every minute we can delay them gives the Navy a better chance to eat their carriers. That's our job, Major. Fighting hath than we got." Back at Pearl Harbor, confirmation came true to electrified Rajvasteen. Japanese Tradon sent reply and recruited Majans and reached bearings in Raj remains. The tide was defiantly Midway. Armed with this crucial intelligence, Nimitz called his senior commanders to an urgent meeting. "Gentlemen, we know where they're going and approximately when," Nimitz announced to these sympathizers. "The Japanese are sending at least 4 carriers to attack Midway in early June. This is our chance to ambush them." Captain Miles Brayling calls his chief style who now serve under Spruance, staying the intelligence pods. "Sir, our pilots are reporting at least 6 Japanese carriers operational. If they bring them all—" They ringed. Nimitz interrupted a quiet conference. "Our intelligence indicates they're splitting their forces. 2 carriers are heading for the Aleutians as a diversion. That leaves 4 for Midway, and we'll be waiting with 3. The mathematics was still daunting. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. Their pilots were the best in the world, with years of combat experience. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, had brave crews but far less experience. Moreover, Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of Midway. It was limping back to Pearl Harbor. "How long to repair Yorktown?" Nimitz asked, tearing to his meeting saucer. 3 months mere in that bull. She took bomb hits that went deep into her structure. There's significant damage to her flight deck and fuel systems. "You have 3 days," Nimitz said flatly. "Whatever it takes, I want that ship operational and sailing with the others." The maintenance officer's jaw dropped, but he saw the determination in Nimitz's eyes. "Here, sir. We'll work around the cook. As Major to her clothes, pull flight deck again to hide desperate activity. 1,400 workers swarmed of Yorktown, welding, hammering, and installing new equipment. The reprints that should have taken months were compressed into 72 hours of superhuman effort. Men worked till they collapsed from exhaustion, knowing every rivet they drove, every plate a welding, might make the differing between victory and defeat. Niftan commanded John Thatch, one of the newest premier fighter pinned, but his pilots would you pound. He had developed new tactics specifically to counter the superior maneuverability of the Japanese Zero, which had dominated every aerial engagement so far. Listen up, Thatch addressed his young aviators. The Zero can out-tour us, outcline us, at fasty, but likely built. Our Wildcats can take punishment and keep fine. We're going to use a new formation I call the Sat Weave. Work in pairs, cover each other, and never try to dogfight a Zero one-on-one. One of the pilots was Ensign George Gay, fresh from fly school with barely 300 hours of flight time. Then Texan tried to hide his nervousness as Thatch explained how he would attack the Japanese fleet. The torpedo bombs would go in low on Zero, perfect to target fine-on fighters and anti-aero fire. Everyone knew Portuguese suicide mission, but no one voiced their fears. In the intelligence offices, analysts worked to piece together the complete Japanese order of battle. The new Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was personally commanding the operation. The strike force would be led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded Pearl Harbor. The intelligence painted a picture of overwhelming Japanese confidence. The coming to finish where that started 6 months earlier. They're bringing everything, reported one of Nimitz's planning officers. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports with invasion troops. They intend to take Midway and use as a base for further operations against Y. Let them come, Nimitz responded calmly. They're bringing the force, the war they have to lose. On May 28th, Task Force 16, centered on Enterprise and Hornet and Despruens his command, slipped out of Pearl Harbor. The carrier was screened by cruisers and fours, the crew the battle stations. 2 days later, on May 30th, Hound Phi, their hulls to baying fish wills and patus. The 3 carriers would rendezvous northeast of Midway at a position designated Point Luck, perfectly positioned to ambush the approaching Japanese. Aboard Enterprise, Spruant studied the latest intelligence updates with his staff. The quiet admiral was known to his analytical mind and careful playing. Unlike the impulsive Hosey, Spruant calculated every mood, considering all possibilities before making decisions. The Japanese expect to achieve surprise, Spruant told his staff. They believe our carriers are still in the South Pacific, back at Pearl Harbor. That overconfidence is our greatest advantage. We must use it wisely. Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding Enterprise Agro, prepared his pilots for what lay ahead. A veteran naval aviator, Akagi stood past the capabilities and limitations as aircraft and man. When we find their carriers, we hit them with everything we've got, McCluskey briefed his squadron commanders. The dive bombers will attack from high altitude while the torpedo planes go in low. Fighter cover will be omitted. Safe feed, prize are essential. Among McCluskey's pilots, we Lieutenant Richard Dick Best, commanding bombing squadron 6. Best was known for his exceptional accuracy in dive bombing, his skill that was soon briefed crucial. He gathered his own pilots for a more detailed briefing. Brimming were looking for their carriers, not the battleships or cruisers, Best emphasized. I don't care how tempting the tarts look. We think they're carriers, and we win this war. As May turned to June, both fleets moved toward their fate for encounter. The Americans had positioned themselves briefly, thanks to their code-breaking success. But intelligence was only part of the equation. The coming battle would be decided by the skill and courage of the pilots. The heathens are quandas under extreme pressure, and the thin margin between victory and disaster characterized carry warfare. A new itself, operations which v pitch, every veil acquart with art of feud. Arranged the defensive positions in the quarrel sand. Radar operators scanned the skies continuously. knowing that the first warning of the Japanese approach would come from their screens. The garrison knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they also knew their role. Hold out long enough for the Navy to strike the enemy carriers. Commander Cyril Simard, Midway's senior officer, made a final inspection of the defenses. The atoll's two small islands were packed with ammunition, fuel tanks, and upright. One well-placed bomb could turn the entire base into an inferno. But there was no choice. Everything depended on Midway, holding out long for the carriers to do their work. As dark as on June 3, 1942, American PBY Catalina patrol planes bound for Midway in long search patterns. These slow, ungainly aircrafts would be the first to spook the unfortunate enemy. Their crews knew that making contact with the Japanese fleet meant almost certain death, as the lumbering patrol planes were easy prey for Zero fighters. But fighting the enemy was worth any sacrifice. At 0900 on June 3rd, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY, spotted ships on the horizon. Sighted main body, he radioed. Bearing 262, dead in 700 miles. The Japanese invasion force had been found, but the carriers remained hidden. That afternoon, 9 B-17s from Midway took the invasion convoy but scored no hits. 4 PBYs equipped with torpedoes attempted the night attack, claiming 1 hit. While these attacks scored no of making point, they hurt the Japanese that the Americans knew they were carrying. At 0300 on June 4th, relay sounded Butai made interiors. In ready rooms, pilots received final briefings and wrote last letters home. Mechanics made fine checks on aircraft. Ordnance crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. 3 carriers with barely 230 aircraft were about to take on the pride of the Japanese Navy. The odds were steep, but the Americans were fighters, and knew the enemy's coin, and knew where to find them, and they had commanders willing to take calculated risks. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in overall command aboard Yorktown, made the decision that would govern American tactics for the coming battle. Rather than keeping his carriers together for mutual protection, he would operate them separately, reducing the risk of all 3 being caught together. It was gamble, but the entire operation with a gamble meant a scare. As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, the stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The Japanese came as supreme confidence, expecting to catch the Americans by surprise. Instead, they were sailing into a carefully prepared trap. The U.S. Navy, battered but not broken, Pearl Harbor, was about to demonstrate of more determination and ingenuity could overcome even the most daunting odds. At 0430 hours on June 4, the pre-dawn darkness over Midway was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga led 108 Japanese aircraft from the 4 carriers toward their target. The attack force included 36 torpedo bombers carrying conventional bombs for ground attack, 36 dive bombers, and 26 Zero fighters for a squad. As they fought up at the darkness, not one of the Japanese aviators suspected that American carriers lurked nearby, waiting. On Midway, radar operator detected the incoming strike at 0552. Many planes bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 miles. The operator reporting, his voice jettied as about as raging hot. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Marines ran to their battle stations while pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Every flyable plane on Midway had to get airborne immediately or risk destruction on the ground. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 into the dawn sky, including his obsolete Buffalo fighters, knowing they were heading into a massacre. The Buffaloes slower, less maneuverable, and more laxly armed than the Zeri. But Henderson's Marines had absolute determination to protect their base at any cost. Enemy fighters, 12 o'clock high. The radio crackled with warnings as the Marines met the incoming strike force head-on. The views pounced on the American fighters like hawks on pins. When Mimi is sky were filled with burning American planes, spiring 12 the ocean. Anatha's Akrelf of among those Shutan as he led his squadron's dive bombers in their attack. But the Marine sacrifice wasn't in vain. Their attack disrupted Japanese formation and forced the Bullas to take evasive action. More importantly, it bought precious time for Midway's bond force to clear the Ain and head for the Japanese fleet, whose position had been reported by Sutring PBY patrol blinds. At 0630, Tominaga's force reached Midway and began their attack runs. Guns rained down at the airfield, fuel tanks and defensive positions. The island's anti-aircraft guns blazed away, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke. A direct hit and power station knocked out Midway's radar. Another bomb set the fuel tanks ablaze, sending thick cones of smoke in the wrong sky. As Tominaga was sacked down, he realized the attack could fail in its primary objective. The runways were crated but repairable. Many defensive positions remained intact. Most critically, they destroyed few aircraft on ground because the Americans had cut in airborne in time. Tominaga radioed back to Admiral Nimitz. There's need for a fair attack wave. Its message would trigger a chain of regimes that would join the battle's action. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nimitz faced a dilemma. He held back 93 aircraft armed with anti-ship weapons, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, in case American ships appeared. Should he rearm with ground attack weapons for the strike on Midway, or keep them ready in the targets? At Jerry Sanfetti, Nimitz made his fateful decision. Rearmed the aircraft 8 bombers for land attack. Crews immediately began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and replacing them with conventional bombs. It was dangerous work on crowded hangar decks, with armed ordnance being moved around volatile aviation fuel and ammunition. Unknown to Nimitz, 200 miles to the northeast, American carriers were relaunching the trucks. Admiral Nimitz, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, had made the crucial decision to launch everything he had at maximum range. It was a calculated risk. His planes would barely have enough fuel to return, but would catch the Japanese at their most vulnerable moment. "Pilots, man your planes!" The order echoed across the American fight decks. A then Commander John London led White to P. Huntering Ed. Mine had Zagati slow variable Douglas T.B. Tas aids. In his ready room briefing, he had been brutally honest with his men. "As we run out of gas, we're ditched again. If only one of us makes it through, leak high. May God be with us all." Aldrin's pilot Ensign George Gay, the Texan who would soon become the Ryu his squadron. As Gay climbed into his Devastator, he checked his rear gunner's position. Radio man Bob Huntington gave him a thumbs up, trying to mask his own fear with bravado. By 800, the American strike was airborne, scattered. The different squadrons became separated in clouds, each proceeding independently toward the estimated Japanese position. His lack of coordination proved both weakness and paradoxically of strength in the coming engagement. Meanwhile, Nagumos Provence were modified. At 0728, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally reported 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed 20 knots. The pilot hadn't identified ship types, a crucial oversight that left Nagumo uncertain whether he faced carriers or merely a surface force. "Suspend rearming operations," Nagumo ordered. But confusion reigned on the Japanese hangar decks. Some aircraft were fully rearmed, others were half converted, and ordnance was scattered everywhere in the rush to complete the changeover. The delay would prove fatal. At 0820, the Tone Scout plane sent another report that chilled Nagumo's blood. Enemy ships are accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The Americans had carriers at sea, and his own aircraft were in chaos, caught between configurations. His first strike was retiring from Midway, low on fuel, and needing to land immediately. The first American attacks came from Midway-based aircraft, Marine dive bars and Army B-17s attacking for an high off-P. The uncoordinated attacks scored no hits, and the Japanese carriers easily invaded foreign bonds. 0 fighters slaughtered the Marine planes, but each failed attack forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver, delaying flight operations. At 0920, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron spotted the Japanese fleet through breaks in the Kleins. His torpedo squadron with Lu having become separated from the fighters and dive bars. Waldron knew attacking the fighter cavern was suicide, but he also knew this might be their only chance. "Attack immediately," Waldron ordered, leading his 15 Devastators down toward the Japanese carriers. The Zerriers waiting. As the torpedo bars lumbered toward their targets, waved up height, the Japanese fighters attacked ferociously. One by one, the Devastators burst into flame and crashed into the sea. Ensign Gay watched in horror as the squadron meets down around him. Waldron's plane was hit and cut-wheeled into the ocean. Others exploded in mid-air or broke apart under the concentrate fire. A pressed on, his guard Huntington firing disparate flying Zerries until he was killed by Brett can fire. Gay released a torpedo the carrier Soryu and flew directly over the ship so low he could see the face of the Japanese sails. Moments later, his plane was riddled with bullets and crashed into the sea. Wounded but alive, Gay inflated his life jacket and hid under a floating seat cushion, becoming an unwilling spectator to the battle's climax. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been annihilated. All 15 Devastators were shot down. Of 30 men, only George Gay survived. Their torpedoes, plagued by technical pull-ins, either missed or failed to explode. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The attack had pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to Hilo, leaving the high altitudes undefended. More American torpedo squadrons arrived with sail fates. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 Akris. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 10 to 12. The absolute devastators and their defective torpedoes seemed to validate Japanese confidence in their superiority. At the repeated attacks of forcing constant evasive maneuvers, preventing the Gumo from launching or covering aircraft. By 1020, the Japanese carriers ran caters. Returning aircraft from the Midway strike circled overhead, desperately low on fuel. The flight decks reclined with atrons being refueled and rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered on the hangar decks. 5 safety procedures were being known in the rush to prepare to strike against the American carriers. It is at this moment of maximum vulnerability it conned the way McCluskey arrived overhead with 33 dive bombs front bros. McCluskey did let his squadrons on the exhausting search, flying beyond the point where fewer dared to let a foot. Just he was back to on deck. He spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. Correctly guessing it was heading to rejoin the main fort, McCluskey fired whole. At 10:22, McCluskey's perseverance would. Through breaks in the clad, he saw the Japanese carriers spread out below. Their fight deck adapted that berth. No zero jointing north here. Nuroy Seer, Finch north lost 2 heel bars. McCluskey split his force, assigning squadrons to different targets, and gave the order millions of Americans had been waiting for since Pearl Harbor. Attack immediately. Lieutenant Dick Best led his squadron toward Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. He pushed over into his die, Best kept eyeing the grain ship of the carrier. At 2,500 feet, he needed 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out sharply. Behind him, he meets Salim Bisayikli. Both bombs missed. A pilot was exhausted in diving through anti-aircraft fire, but Best's bomb was perfectly placed. It punched through Akagi's flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck and unfueled on die-cast. The heart was catastrophic. Secondary Spain rippled through hip fuel and oils that hated her chain reaction. Their mates, Akagi, were unfirm. Simultaneously, Parker was it at least 4 bonds to McCluskey's Lesquane. The hits started uncontrollable fires among the packed aircraft. At nearly the fang time, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive-bombs from Yukon scored 3 direct hits on Soryu and Tark. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japan's premier carriers of burning wrecks. From a fighting place in the water, Ensign Gawers, the Japanese carriers explode. The ships that served went among the fog were now fuel pipes. He could see Japanese sailors abandoning ship, leaping into the oil-covered ocean to escape the flames. The bodies of his squadron mates floated nearby. Their sacrifice had made dismount puzzle. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer slag from the burning Akagi to a cruiser, was in shock. 3/4 of his striking power had been eliminated in Minsk. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were finished. Only Hiryu remained operational, racing northwest to escape while launching a counterstrike. A Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility, built through 6 months of victories, had been shattered. The battle wasn't over. Hiryu's counterstrike found Yoktang early at Opferine. The fight dethroned defense by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Japanese type-wise squad 3 heaps left in Ark and Carrier Brine listing. Damage control parties fought desperately to save the ship, and their efforts seemed successful, until a second strike by torpedo bombers put 2 more torpedoes into Yorktown's hull. Admiral Fletcher transferred to a cruiser, passing technical command to Spruance. Yorktown's crew abandoned ship, but the Tusk carrier refused to sink. She would remain afloat until June 7th, when Japanese submarine Y-168 found her and delivered the final torpedo hits that sent her to the bottom. The loss of Yukon was painful, but by then Hiryu had joined her sisters in destruction. Late on June 4th, dive bombs for Enterprise found the last Japanese carrier and left her burning from stern to stern. 4 Japanese carriers, the core of the force that attacked Pearl Harbor, now lay in the bottom of the Pacific. At 2004, American pilots returned to their carriers with barely fumes in their tanks. Many aircraft, damaged in combat or out of fuel, ditched in a docking sea. Destroyers raced to rescue pilots from war. The human cost had been high. The fatigue victory was complete. Admiral Spruance, cautious and calculating, resisted the temptation to pursue recruiting Japanese. He knew Yamamoto's battleships were following the dockings, and his pilots were exhausted. Bitter to pursue his victory, the Riches carried a night engagement where battleship guns could be delayed. It was a cultivated decision, but it proved correct. As June 5th dawned, American search planes found only burning hulks and scattered survivors where the Japanese fleet had been. The few remaining Japanese aircraft lunged from cruisers and the crippled carriers before they sank, made desperate attacks but achieved nothing. Over the next 2 days, American forces continued to talk sound retreating Japanese, sinking the heavy cruiser Macrumer and damaging other vessels. The Digested was staggering. Japan had lost 4 fleet headmen, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. The Americans lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 140 heavy aircraft, and 3 V-62 men. The numbers only truth part of the story. Japan's affairs have been promptly killed. The anciency had passed to the Americans. In the aftermath, both sides sought to understand what had happened. For the Americans, victory valued to their faith in intelligence and calculated reality. Nimitz is to saying to trusty code breakers, Sroons Cathal taught to go to hand, and the encode card the pirates had combined to achieve what sand and button. That it happened, Midway would have claimed half-thought, supposed fundamental thought in the plan of doing. A sunshine superiority, the complex operational plan that dispersed their forces, the failure to adequately scout for American carriers, and the crucial minutes of vulnerability during the rearming process had all contributed to disaster. A estimation put in factor the sacrifice of the American torpedo bomber crews. Their seemingly futile attacks had created the conditions for victory by dispersing Japanese operations and pulling down the fighting power. Men like John Waldron and his squadron had known they were flying to almost certain death, but they pressed home their attacks anyway. As news of the victory spread, America erupted in celebration. After 6 months of defeat and retreat, the United States had won first major victory against Japan. The road to Totran, Boulogne, and Midway, and Midway proved could be found. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible since Pearl Harbor, had been decisively beaten by a smaller American force. In Japan, the government hid the extent of the defeat from the public. Returning says were isolated to prevent word from spreading. The official story claimed a great victory. The Navy knew the truth. The offensive phase of Japan's war was over. From now on they would be on the defensive, trying to fall what they had conquered against an increasingly powerful American counteroffensive. The Battle of Midway became a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in world history. It demonstrated intelligence properly used overcome numerical disadvantage. It showed that courage and sacrifice in apparent failure could create opportunities for victory. Most importantly, it proved to the United States in the will and capability to defeat even four enemy. Admiral Nimitz, in his after-action report, gave credit where it was due, to the codebreakers who'd uncovered the Japanese plan, to the commanders who'd made crucial decisions under pressure, and above all to the pilots who pressed home their attacks against overwhelming odds. He also recognized the way of choice in war. Had the American dive bombers wait, where would it lead? After the Japanese had lost their victory, the outcome might have been very different. The Japanese Navy would never recover from Midway. The full Kai's lost represented years of construction, a decades of pilot training that could not be replaced. While Japan would commission new carriers, they never again achieved the Peninsular ships, aircraft, and experienced air crews that had made their early victories possible. For the young American pilots who survived, Midway was a defining moment. Men like Dick Best, who had placed the bomb that doomed Akagi, would continue flying throughout the war, but nothing matched the intensity those females of the Japanese fleet. Ours, like Ensign Gay, would carry the memory of fond carnage of the rift of a lines. The biting Mofine Montemont mission and main Monfin. For the first time, a major naval engagement had been fought entirely by aircraft, with the opposing fleets never coming within sight of each other. The age of the battleship was ending. The aircraft carrier was now the done weapon of naval warfare. In the broader context of World War II, Midway makes Sangrai, the point where seemingly unstoppable advance is not disfluted and averted. Combined with the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal, the father, it marked a king of Japan's war treat to cut a havoc. The industrial might of America, fully mobilized for war, would produce ships and aircraft in quantities Japan could never match. The veterans of Midway would go on to fight in the Salmines, Philippines, and eventually to the doorstep of Japan itself. They had learned if the Japanese could be beat, that American training and equipment, properly employed, were more than a match for enemy skill and determination. For Japan, Midway exposed the fatal flaw in their strategic planning. They began a war against an enemy with 10 times their industrial capacity, lean spiritual superiority come material disadvantage. The Americans had shown Midway that they possessed both material strength and the will to use it. The codebreakers who made victory pleasure received little plank recognition during the war. Their work meant classified for decades. But officers like Rushford and his team had arguably won the most important intelligence victory in American history. By solving the puzzle of AF and predicting Japanese movements, they had given Nimitz the information needed to position his forces perfectly. Lieutenant Commander Rushford, despite his crucial role, would be reassigned shortly after Midway due to bureaucratic conflict at Washington. His team's success had proven that intelligence could win battles, but inter-service rivalries would prevent him from receiving proper recognition until decades later. In 1986, he was posthumously awarded a Navy Distinguished Service Medal. As the years passed, Midway took almost mythical status in American military history. It became the textbook example as how intelligence, courage, and tactical excellence could combine to achieve victory against superior forces. Military academies around the world studied the battle, seeking to understand how the Americans achieved such a complete reversal of fortune. The human dimension of Midway should never be forgotten. Behind the strategic movements and tactical scenes were individual acts of heroism that determined the outcome. The Marine pilots who flew obsolete fighters against Zeros, the torpedo bomber crews who pressed their attacks without fighter cover, with bomber pilots who searched the pilot's safe return, the tide control parties who saved ships, all contributed to victory. The Battle of Midway proved that democracies could fight and win against totalitarian enemies. The American carriers were crewed by citizen sailors, many of whom had been civilians just months before. They faced an enemy with years of combat experience and a tradition victory. Yet when the moment came, these Americans performed with skill and courage that matched anything their nation's history. The lesson of Midway resonates beyond its historical moment. It reminds us that apparent weakness can be turned to strength through intelligence and determination. That sacrifice, even in failure, can create opportunities for others. That technological superiority means nothing the will to use effectively. And free nations when threatened, and summon the courage to defend themselves against any odds. At the sun set on June 4, 1942, the tide of the Pacific War turned decisively. The Japanese would fight on with characteristic determination for 3 more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. At Midway, a smaller American force had destroyed the height of Japanese naval power and seized the initiative. Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war prediction had proven prophetic. He had warned that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that he had no confidence. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The architect of Japan's early victories understood once America could mobilize its sting, Japan's defeat is At Midway, inevitably came reality, and the burning hopes of 4 aircraft carriers and the sacrifice of brave men fought and died for their nations at the Vault Pasir Sturl. The impact of Midway extended far beyond the immediate technical victory. It demonstrated that the United States could gather intelligence, land operations, and execute complex naval battles with precision. The coordination between code breakers, planners, and combat forces had created a new model for modern warfare. Future operations would build on these lessons, combining intelligence gathering with technical execution. For the individual sailors and airmen who fought at Midway, the battle represented a personal triumph over fear and adversity. Young men who had never seen combat performed acts of extraordinary courage. Mechanics worked through exhaustion to keep planes flying. Damage control teams saved ships that should have sunk. Radio operators maintained communications under fire. Each person's contribution, no matter how to achieve victory. The Japanese pilots and sailors who fought at Midway all set of fate Marco card of few. Does that have thought that befell their carriers, that foot at the suddenly sunk the Sank, may choose death over surrender, going down with their ships or flying their damaged aircraft into the sea rather than be captured. Their sacrifice, the Manaluzan cause, reflected the wire tuition made them set fung into her bones. At the aftermath of Midway, both navies would apply the lessons learned. The Americans, with their flying their carrier tactics, improved their aircraft and have better torpedoes. The Japanese would struggle to rebuild their carrier forces and train new pilots to replace those lost. But the fundamental shift in momentum could not be reversed. America's industrial production would soon flood the Pacific with new ships and planes, while Japan's resources dwindled. The Battle of Midway stands as one of history's most decisive naval engagements. And the span a few minutes on June 4, 1942, the course of the Pacific War changed forever. American dive bars arriving at the perfect moment struck Japanese carriers through the resulting destruction ended Japan's offensive capabilities and began the long American fight across the Pacific. Today, Midway toward the war by range, if wars rendered for surface quiver. Towards a ramp main held round, where brave men from both nations fought and died in a battle that shaped the modern world. Their sacrifice reminds us that freedom requires vigilance, intelligence, and preparation come seemingly in some odd words, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when their nations vital and state. The legacy of Midway lives on in the United States Navy's emphasis on intelligence, terror aviation, and flexible tactics. It proved that naval warfare had entered a new age, where information was as important as firepower, where aircraft could sink the mightiest ships, and where victory went to those who adapt fastest to changing circumstances. These lessons continue to guide naval strategy in the 21st century. As we remember Midway, we honor not just the victory, but the men who achieved. From Admiral Nimitz making strategic decisions at Pearl Harbor, to Ensign Gay floating in the ocean watching his squadron's sacrifice bear fruit, each participant played a vital role. Their combined efforts turned potential defeat into decisive victory, changing the course of victory and demonstrating the free peoples, united and purpose, can overcome any challenge. The Battle of Midway was more than a military victory. It was a triumph of intelligence over ignorance, preparation over complacency, and courage over fear. It showed that America had the will and ability to fight a global war and win. Most importantly, it proved the wise do ascend free, defend I brave and win, could prevail against tyranny and aggressor. At lesson, Lurge and the workers around the Torre Pacifico, each were a faithful June 1942.